You mentioned something that I haven't heard before. You said opinionated product vision. What does that mean?
It means that your product can't be all things to all people, and that's how you get in trouble, right? When you try to appease everybody, you wind up appeasing nobody. So you have to make a decision. Like, for example, at Rotific, you got to ask the question, like, okay, who is this product for? Is it for Amazon? Probably not, because Amazon has their own software, but also it's such a large, complicated corporation that maybe this isn't the problem that we necessarily want to tackle right now. Whereas we got to ask the question, do we want to target like mom and pop shops? And maybe somebody who does deliveries only once around Valentine's Day. And I mean, you could make the user experience like really focused on this highly, uh, you know, technically non-savvy client. Like, I don't know what the opposite of tech savvy is, but this like basically like making like your grandma your target client base, and you could make software that is really easy to use in that sense and make a lot of decisions around it. Um, but it's very different from the type of software that like a dispatcher at Amazon would use, because once you're a dispatcher at Amazon, that's your full-time job. Like, you're not worried about clean UI. You want as much information on the screen as possible. This is an issue we ran into when I was working at Lendesk, where we tried to essentially create the same software to use for both the broker and the lender side of the equation, and it was somewhat successful. The problem was that like your average mortgage broker is, I think, if I remember correctly, it was like a 55-year-old woman, and they have very different needs from your average underwriter who's like a 30-year-old male. When we were dealing with underwriters, they just wanted more information on the screen at the same time. Like, if we could have shoved everything onto one screen at like 8-point font, they would have been happy, even though in theory they're using the same information, but the mortgage brokers wouldn't have been able to read that at all. And so you got to ask yourself the question, like, well, who's this software for? Is it for mortgage brokers? Is it for lenders? And I think that's an issue where we ran into some trouble early on in Lendesk, is not being opinionated enough, even because in theory the same group of people could use the same software, but in practice they have very different needs. And so that's what you have to do, is you have to find who your software is for, and that will allow you to create your opinions around how complex this should be. How much information do you need to display at the same time? Do you need like wizards to guide people through specific processes, or can you just have a whole bunch of options open because this is a person's full-time job, right? Like, a great example is like Robinhood versus a really complex day trading app where you have like all these graphs on your screen at the same time. Your day-to-day, like your typical average Joe investor, is going to be way too overwhelmed with all of this information, and so they need something simpler. They need like a wealth simple trade or something like that. Whereas your high-end stockbroker is not going to, like, they're not going to be satisfied with just seeing the basic stock price and maybe a stock ticker and a couple of values on their cell phone. Like, they need more information. So you got to know, who are you making this for?
That's a really good call. That's one thing I've been kind of fighting for in my industry, like not at the current company I'm at, but at previous jobs I've had, where the thing I struggle with and to convey to leaders sometimes is that if you don't have that vision defined, you're making your developer's life harder. Because as a developer, even though it might seem like, okay, the developers are just pumping out code, but the reality is every day they need to make a decision, right? Do I do A versus B? Do I dig a little deeper here? Do I write code in a certain way that can be refactored, or do I kind of, is this something that's small piece? And if you don't have that vision, you're just leaving it up to chance for the developer to make the right calls whenever they kind of approach that fork in the road. Whereas with a well-defined vision, you can always come back to it and say, okay, or actually our vision is, for example, in your case, or something, examples you gave is like a grandma that's doing something. So if I'm going to build this, that's our product vision. Therefore, I'm going to make it in a way where it's easier, more user-friendly, even if it's not to do with the UI, right? If it's to do with just some of the functional things, how they're working on the back end. And it's interesting to see that in design that same thing applies, right?
Well, the designer is the same thing as a developer, right? Like you're making decisions all the time, and you got to know, like at the end of the day, what makes one decision better than the other. There's trade-offs and there's benefits to everything, and so you have to know which direction do we want to move in. I mean, we've had this conversation, not you and I, sorry, I've had this conversation many times at every company that I've worked at. Is like, well, who is this for? Like, who am I targeting with this? Whether it's on the product design side of it or in like communications design, building like a marketing piece, like who is this piece of marketing collateral supposed to target, right? Like, who is this Facebook ad for? Who is this LinkedIn ad for? We're putting out a editorial in whatever publication. Who is it targeting? Like, who is the audience that'll dictate the type of language that you use, that dictates the design patterns that you want to use, that dictates the size of the font that you want to use, to be like perfectly honest, because you and I are fairly young and we're used to working in like design and development environments. I have my screen resolution cranked up even like on my 15-inch MacBook here, because I can read the small font. It's not that big of a deal for me, and I just want to be able to have more screen real estate.
Say, speak for yourself. I got my glasses here that I need when I'm looking at at this screen. So I'm getting old, man.
I'm just stereotyping you into every developer I know that's got their 27-inch screen turned sideways and is trying to read like every line of code in their 1,000 code or their 1,000 line library.
I think that's a very good point though about even something as simple as a font could make a big difference in how the user perceives it.
Yeah, and like different choices of fonts will also impact it as well, right? Like, Roboto is like a nice little clean font that Google loves to use, and I think it's their default material design font now. And it's good, right? Like you can use it in smaller spaces. You can make it smaller, and you can use it in tighter spaces. Sorry, so with less padding and stuff like that around it. You can't necessarily get away with that in like a serif font with all these like little fancy, tabs along the bottom of it or along the bottom of each letter. You need a bit more breathing space to make that legible, and you have to take all of that kind of information into account, along with all of that sort of factors into your decision making around like your brand identity, for example, and your like design language and all these other things that you need to consider. So all of these decisions, they kind of compound on each other, and if you don't know who you're designing for, um, then you can't make these decisions because they're all equally valid.
You mentioned design language. That's something I've always been fascinated by because obviously the big tech companies, Google, like as you mentioned, or Apple, they have their fancy design languages. And um, is that something that when you work at a particular company or a particular product, is that like one of the things that I guess as a designer you have to define is like what is the design language for this product or company that I'm working at?
Yeah, if it hasn't been defined already, then that should be one of the first things you do is define the design language. And so all it is, it's not like it sounds like a fancy word, but all it is like a set of rules, set of paradigms and like design patterns that you can use for your product. And it's sort of it's a way to keep your decisions consistent. So if you have created a particular design language, like you want to use certain colors because they resonate well with the target audience that you're dealing with, right? Like, or the particular sensibilities of your product, right? Like green is a common color for financial apps, right? And like blue is a common color just in the tech industry in general. Um, so you make these decisions, and so you can keep them consistent throughout your experience. It's not that big of a deal when actually, in all honesty, it's probably still a big deal when you're one designer working at a tiny company, but it becomes an even bigger deal when you have multiple designers now making decisions around your product and building out individual features, right? You don't want one designer to decide to put an editing function inside of a modal or you hit this edit button, modal pops up, and a different designer to decide like, oh, we're going to do an inline edit over here. Now that may be a perfectly valid decision. It may be the right decision to make, in all honesty, but it has to be purposeful, and it can't be just because one person prefers it over the other. And usually you can set that as one of your standards inside of your design language. Like in our case, we are going to decide that all editing will happen inside of a modal because editing doesn't happen that often. It can be a secondary action, and we can then tailor our views for readability rather than editability. Because if you're going to allow for editing, now you need extra space for form padding and stuff like that. Like there's all these other things that you need to consider into it. And there's, like I said, there's trade-offs to everything. And so if you make that decision early on, that's it'll pay off dividends for you later, because then you don't have to worry about it again. You don't have to keep remaking the same decision. And that's what the design language is there to support.
Got it. And how do you? I guess other times where two design languages clash, what comes to my mind, and this is something I've seen happen over the course of iPhones and Android tablets becoming popular, is that I've seen apps try to mimic the design language of the platform. I've also seen apps trying to enforce their own design language, and I think I've also seen apps pick an iPhone design or iOS design language and then force it on Android. And all of those have their pros and cons. But I guess, what is the train of thought there? How do you kind of bring those two worlds together when you as a company have your own design language and then the platform that you're going to be on has its own?
Yeah, it's a bit of a tough one. I'm sure Google would love for everybody to adopt Material Design, who puts out like an Android product, but the reality is like you're not going to redesign your entire app for Apple and then for Android separately, right? You're going to release them roughly at the same time. They're going to be, based on similar design sensibilities, similar flows. You might tailor the navigation a little bit from like tabs to segmented controls, from going from Android to iOS, but you're not going to like redo the whole thing. The good thing is though, I think, if you're a sensible designer, you're going to create a language that is, you know, hopefully on trend enough that you can fit into those like the design languages of the OS that you're dealing with directly. Now that said, like I mean, you don't have to necessarily use the paradigms or like the built-in UI from anything. If you're building a native app, or even if you're building like a browser-based app, which is becoming progressively more common, at least from what I've seen on for like web develop or for mobile development, is having responsive apps rather than having native apps. Um, but you can make it so that it sort of complements one another, because for the most part, the design language from your mobile OS will it kind of only minorly affects what you're doing. Most of the design language people are going to be interacting with, like most of the UI elements that people are interacting with, are going to be whatever you've coded in. Now, maybe you don't want to. Maybe you want to use native components, and that's perfectly fine. Um, in which case, your design language is going to fit anyway, and you're golden.